For getting into cooking, I was in programming for years and ended up finding out that the best part of my day was making a meal. And then after that, it was making a meal that everyone could enjoy. So I started focusing on cooking and now cooking things that people can eat regardless of their dietary limits.
So, for starters, what exactly is the dish that you would like to talk about, if there's a specific one?
It's apple strudel. I wanted to talk about this because it was a particular challenge for me to learn and then master. It's a traditional dessert dish in Germany and the surrounding areas. Pastry with apples and breadcrumbs and seasoning like cinnamon and baked in the oven. The reason I wanted to talk about this was when I started at the first restaurant I was really working at, the very first day, at the end of the shift, he's like, okay, now I'm going to teach you something difficult. And it's a long process. It's literally taking the dough and getting it ready and then letting it sit for a while to let the gluten develop. And while you're doing that, you spend about 2 hours peeling and cutting up pieces of apple, which teaches you discipline because you have to stand there and do nothing else. And apple is really boring to cut. When that's all finally ready, you get a cloth and you put that on the table and you roll out the dough. The reason why this was such a challenge for me was on the first day as I was being shown how to do it, he is doing this effortlessly. It looks like he's just taking a piece of dough and making it like pizza, stretching it thin, puts it out, cuts it, process. The second it touches my hand, I realize how wrong I am in my head. There's no way this is going to be simple. The trick to making a good strudel is you have to be able to read newspaper through it. That's how thin, how stretched it is. So you take just like a handful of dough and you end up making it 3 feet by 3 feet wide and as thin as you can imagine. Then you have to properly get all your trimmings on. So like the apples, the right spices. If you don't do it right, obviously it's going to taste like shit and hours of work gone, which is horrendous. It makes you feel really bad. The second time I made it, did not season well, and it was just a complete flop. So you got to get everything right amount of raisins. The ratio for breadcrumbs to apples has to be exact, because if it's too little, then you end up with a whole bunch of dry breadcrumbs. There's not enough breadcrumbs, they get overly wet and all the liquid comes out. If you have too much, it's just dry and breadcrumby. So the reason you have breadcrumbs is to keep the apple's moisture as it cooks, because otherwise it gets released out of the strudel and makes a hell of a mess. And you lose so much flavor and you lose so much moisture. So you got to get all the ratios right. And if there's too much liquid, if the apples have been out for too long and they've started to release, or if you put too much lemon juice and it's in there and it's touching the pastry, as soon as you go to move it, it will tear. You'll have these terrible holes that are almost impossible to repair, and any work you put into repairing them, you're going to see. So the apple strudel will have huge gashes and it'll look horrible. So the reason you put it on a cloth is that it's so thin and sticky that if you tried to move it in any other way, you'd be screwed. But you take the cloth and you bunch it up and you kind of like roll it onto itself, and you use the cloth to push the dough so it actually sticks together, because it doesn't stick to the cloth when it's all floured. That is a huge aspect of the technique. If you don't have that part right, you could tear it in half. As I said, you could have leaks and rips because of too much liquid. And then on top of that, you have to then get it into the tray. Which is a whole other challenge, because half the time, if you haven't folded it right, the bottom will come out and you'll make a horrible mess. When I first was taught how to do this, came home and I immediately looked up everything that could go wrong, and I crapped myself the entire time, because I'm just like, there's no way I'm ever gonna get this right. I'm not a pastry guy, what am I doing? But specifically, I remember coming home that first day and thinking to myself, I'm gonna get this. There's no way I'm leaving this restaurant without knowing how to properly do this. And 3 weeks before my restaurant closed, I was making it, and my boss looked me in the face. He said, "This is what my grandmother would want you to make." And he told me I had done it. I had done it like in the old country, like his grandmother had taught him. And I was like, shit, I've done it. And just that day, I had found out properly that the restaurant was being closed. So it was an amazing coincidence that after just over a year and about, I think, 2 months, I had managed to come full circle and go from a guy who had literally never touched the stuff, to suddenly being in charge of a kitchen and running everything and making the meals perfectly and making this dish, which I thought was so complex despite its simplicity. The only reason we even continued to make it was because people liked it. The time and the effort was never worth the price that we could charge for it. But everyone loved it. And I literally had people coming into the back of the kitchen, like friends of Will's, the owner, who'd be like, that was fantastic. Just like Mother used to make, or just like back home, because we had a lot of like German, Austrian people who would come to a restaurant, and anytime it came up at all, they'd immediately be like, are you German? Did you get taught this? I'm like, no, but my mentor, Will, he's shown me everything. And it was praise up and down, and it's silly because it's just a little piece of pastry. You look at it and you think to yourself, whatever, like a pie. I mean, it's not science. Well, it is science, but it's not some crazy over-the-top thing. But it's so much more work than you could ever imagine. It's got these layers. It's intricate.